an interesting thing happened yesterday. I say interesting because it's something that people like Scott Galloway, and yes, I will say myself, have been saying Democratic leaders have had to do for a very long time. It's been a concern for several years. And Scott always talks about it. Again, I talk about it at the show. We've talked about it. Young men have been falling further and further behind. Yesterday, Gretchen Whitmer gave a speech and is going to sign an executive order that talks about doing more to help with the disparities that are occurring with young men. And she said this. My message tonight goes out to young people, but especially to young men. I know it's hard to get ahead right now, but I promise you, no matter how hard life might get, there's always a way out and a way up. The last thing any of us want is a generation of young men falling behind their fathers and grandfathers. I've heard most about this issue from moms who love their sons and are worried about them. And then she goes on and she lays out all the disparities for young men getting jobs, young men in college versus women. This goes on and on. You've written a piece talking about how this is, in fact, just as Scott Galloway and many others predicted, this is a reality that Democrats have ignored for too long, according to young men who, again, broke pretty hard for Donald Trump in this last election. Talk about what you found.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Joe. You know, for people our age, sometimes we may look at the complaints coming from young men and we may dismiss them. Maybe not everybody does, but some of us might, because we all remember growing up not always having enough money, or not always getting the girl, or not always getting the job we want. But as I learned from talking to Democrats, as well as demographic specialists and others who have been talking to young men over the past couple of years, and we're talking now, you know, young men from ages 18 to 29, but particularly 18 to 24, who were particularly impacted by the pandemic. These young men have experienced just a much different world than we did, right? So if you came up in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a sense of possibility no matter what your difficulties were. If you came up in the 21st century, you have the 9/11 terrorist attacks, you have the Great Recession, and then you have the coronavirus pandemic, and all of that has left men feeling as though they cannot do as well as their parents did, as their fathers did. And then there's this extra little thing here. And, you know, I spoke to Richard Reeves, who runs the American Institution for Men and Boys, and he talked about just this little fact that right around 2015, 2016 is when the term toxic masculinity entered the lexicon. Now, you know, this can be a politically charged term. I know a lot of people will have opinions about this. But what this sort of has added up to for many men is this idea that they can't just be men, be boys, joke around, not be misogynist, not be rude, but just be masculine, that there is something inherently wrong with them because of just who they are. And Donald Trump and J.D. Vance both spoke to that in a particular way, in part because of who they are, in part because of how Trump acts. But the message received by these men was simply, it's okay to be who you are. There's nothing wrong with you for doing that. And that is always a huge political winner. And that's why there was such a jump in support for Trump among young men compared to 2020. And in fact, compared to all Democratic presidential nominees, at least going back to the beginning of the century. And Democrats I spoke to are concerned about it. Not all of them, but many of them. And they say the party needs to do something about this to be more competitive in 2028, in part because young men become old men, and your politics that is formed in your 20s often can last for decades, if not the rest of your life.
Yeah, you know, what Sam Stein, what oh, we don't have Sam? Sam's out. Sam's out on a coffee break. You know, what Dave Drucker, what we've talked about here, and again, Scott Galloway's talked about it, others have talked about it, I've talked about it with other people on the show, and I've talked about it with people off camera, is the fact that there is toxic masculinity. There is Andrew Tate, who, again, for some bizarre reason, is in the United States now. But so many parents have said that they saw their sons going to school. Even, you know, private schools, public schools over the past 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And having teachers basically talk about collective guilt against them because they were boys. And it sounds bizarre, but that has been a reality.
It has. I have 2 boys. I have more than 3 nephews. What do I have? 4 nephews. This is something that we've all talked about. And look, there are jerks, right? There are people that are just beyond the pale. But that doesn't mean that all men are. And I think as a matter of politics, the point here is if you tell a particular group that you want to appeal to that they're wrong simply for being who they are, let alone if they're wrong at all, it's really hard to win their support. And so, I think this can be hard. And when I was talking to people for the story, they said it can be hard for Democrats to wrap their arms around because obviously for most of human history, men have had it okay compared to everybody else.
Yeah.
Right? I've got nothing to complain about just because I'm a dude. But anywhere from 18 to 29 years old, you just feel differently about that.
Yeah, and that's why it's easy, like me, when you first hear this, you kind of go, yeah, we're doing fine. Don't worry about it. And then it actually becomes a political thing because, again, it's not addressed. It's being addressed again now in Michigan by Governor Whitmer. She's talking about it. And this goes across all demographic groups and is something the Democrats are going to have to figure out how to get their arms around. Senior writer for The Dispatch, David Drucker, and political reporter for Semaphore, Dave Weigel, thank you so much. Also, Washington Bureau Chief at USA Today, Susan Page, thank you all so much. I feel like we need to get Scott Galloway and others on and have this discussion again. It's fascinating.